Greetings from the United Nations headquarters in New York. I'm Lise Kingo, CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. Today, the UN Global Compact Academy, together with We Mean Business, the World Economic Forum, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the B Team, are hosting this special briefing on private sector engagement in the Secretary-General's Climate Action Summit. This comes at a really important moment. Global warming is on the rise. Despite the historic achievements of the Paris Agreement, we are lagging behind in taking the necessary actions to address climate change. We have less than 11 years to fundamentally change our economies, or we will face catastrophic consequences. Young people understand this urgency better than anyone. While adults negotiate, young people are demanding action now. The Secretary-General has described climate change as the battle of his life. This is why he's calling on all leaders to act with urgency and come to New York on September 23rd with clear plans for ambitious climate action. Combating climate change will not happen without the private sector. In other words, we need your leadership to help create the tipping points necessary to turn this around. I'm delighted to be joined at the UN with the UN Secretary's Special Envoy for the Climate Action Summit, Ambassador Luis Alfonso de Alba, Jen Austin from We Mean Business, and SDG advocate Paul Polman, chair of many business organizations, including the ICC and the B Team. So together, in the next 40 minutes or so, we aim to explain how the private sector can contribute to the Climate Action Summit and prepare you for this milestone meeting. We will also be answering your questions live, so please submit them anytime using the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform. So, Ambassador de Alba, may I start with a question to you? So,
Pleasure.
The UN Secretary has called on all leaders in the world for his very important summit in September. So what are the expectations on leaders from government, from civil society, and the private sector to contribute to climate action?
Well, as you mentioned, the Secretary-General is particularly concerned because of the lack of sufficient action and the very alarming reports that we have received, particularly one report from the IPCC on the 1.5 degrees, which tell us precisely that we have a very short time to act. So the Secretary-General is undertaking the commitment to move the international community from negotiations to action.
Right.
And that's a fundamental difference from previous meetings that have been organized at the United Nations. But to be able to identify meaningful actions, he has been calling to all leaders, governmental and non-governmental. The private sector, obviously, as you also said, plays a fundamental role. We need all leaders to come with concrete plans, concrete actions that could be implemented immediately, and actions that will have a follow-up. That's also a new approach, because with some frequency we have asked for commitments, and the follow-up has been quite weak. And we have identified specific areas on which we think that the transformational action can happen. We are building coalitions to identify those actions, those plans. And the invitation for the private sector is precisely to join one of those coalitions. We have coalitions on energy transition, on infrastructure, cities and local action, on industry transition, on nature-based solutions. But we are also addressing fundamental questions like the social and political drivers that are needed to be taken into account for those actions to be successful. Obviously, climate finance, and overall, I would say a strategy to increase the level of ambition in terms of mitigation, reduction of emissions.
So, Ambassador, it looks as if you have a very difficult and challenging tasks for the coming months. But I mean, are you optimistic? Are things progressing according to plan?
I'm very optimistic because I'm looking at a very positive reaction from different sectors, and the public opinion is very much in our side, and the youth movement has proven to be extremely effective. In only a few weeks, a few months, they have been able to help us bringing back the topic to the center of the international agenda. Now we need to deliver. We need to respond to the youth that are very much concerned, and rightly concerned, because the kind of actions that we require to succeed are really exponential, very, very ambitious. Otherwise, we will not succeed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador. So, Paul, may I turn to you? I mean, you are known for taking action. You are known for your incredible leadership in the climate space, and as you're important on the on the boards of all the important business associations that are trying to help drive and prepare for the summit. So what do you think is the most important role for business and investors now and up to the summit in September?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks, Lise, for the opportunity. And I'm certainly pleased to see that all major business organizations, be it the World Business Council, the WEF, the UN Global Compact, the B Team, the ICC, the We Mean Business Coalition, and many others, have an aligned agenda, and climate change is obviously the number one priority next to getting, solving our income inequality issues. It's often closely linked to climate change itself. The Secretary-General is more than right. This is the battle of our lives. It's not only his, it's actually all of us. We're losing about 1 million species now, according to the latest reports. If you look at the destruction on biodiversity, we're projecting still to 3.2 degrees, well above the 1.2, 1.5 that we can afford. So there is work to do. The latest cost estimates on climate change were estimated at $5.3 trillion by the IMF, and that was already 3 years ago. I'm sure that has gone up, yes, as we can see on a daily basis. Now, besides this threat that business well understands and experiences every day, they also understand it's an enormous opportunity. With the new Climate Economy Commission, we looked at just a few areas and found an opportunity of $12 trillion, which is not negligible, obviously. More importantly, next to the $12 trillion, also a 65 million job creation opportunity, and avoiding about 700,000 premature deaths. Just from air pollution being one of the major causes of it. So it's worth fighting for. Now, many things are happening, and we should be pleased. With We Mean Business, it's about 20% of the global GDP that has already signed up. I think it's well over 2,500 companies now that have internalized climate action one way or another, and that's a good thing. We see the financial industry getting involved. The Task Force of Financial Disclosure has now over $9 trillion of companies that are pushing for this, which is a big coalition, more than we've ever seen before. We see the different industry sectors getting involved. The heavy emitting industries like aluminum, steel, shipping, cement, these account for about 30% of the global emissions. We now see in each of these sectors about 20% of the companies already signing up to the science-based targets of staying below 1.5 degrees. So things are moving, and we're pleased about that. But it's also very clear to say that whilst we are all moving, we're not moving fast enough, and we're not moving at the scale that we need. So there's a sense of urgency that we all need to internalize first and foremost, and then turn into action. The encouraging thing is, despite what some people try us to believe, we can actually do it. We have the Climate Change Commission that has come out, or the Energy Transition Commission, and any of the research that you see, with a small investment, we can actually stay at the 1.5 degrees. It's a question not of new technologies or more money than what we currently have, only about 0.5% of investment in GDP. It's a question of willpower. Are we really ourselves able to do this and show courageous leadership? So what do businesses need to do? between now and the summit to make the summit a success. The first thing, most importantly, is sign up to the science-based targets of 1.5 degrees. Anything that's above it, don't participate. You're one that makes it worse. We want companies that improve. Also companies that exist in the future. The other ones I don't think will be around so long. So internalize these 1.5 targets. These science-based targets is the first thing. The second thing, as the ambassador says, get involved in one of those 9 work streams, because we need to close the say-do gap. We need tangible examples. We need companies that want to make those commitments. I'm confident that there are enough companies, but they need, obviously, collectively to show the power. Many people are aware of many initiatives, but not the collectiveness of that. This is a wonderful opportunity. The third one is, I think, stay in the positive methods. There are many people, some that are invested in the current systems that serve them well, some that are outright cynical and don't want to participate in these major change efforts. So there are a lot of critics or skeptics along the road. The newspapers give them disproportionate attention, may I say. We need to be sure that we have that positive message that it can be done, that it is better. It's probably the biggest opportunity, growth opportunity that we have for our economies, so that we get into this positive loop. And then last but not least, I would say the best thing that businesses can do is engage the countries. We have the G20 countries, which account for a little bit more than 80% of the total emission. They are important. You need to focus on them. But we also want to encourage many other countries. There are 18 countries in the world that have implemented the right policies, that have seen carbon emissions going down. They're well on track to the Paris targets, and we should work with them to celebrate. We hopefully can sign up more countries to get to these science-based targets, and most importantly, work also with the G20 countries to make use of this opportunity that we really have to get them to set higher ambitions as well. We've done it in Paris, if I may say, where there were more businesses present than heads of state. Businesses made very clear at that time in the Lima-Paris Action Agenda parallel track what the importance was of taking action, and we saw actually more courage coming out of the politicians. That's what we need for the Secretary-General Summit. That's what we need for the following COP25 in Chile as well, and obviously for the WEF coming up, then the next convention, so that we keep that momentum.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I always enjoy your positive attitude and the whole concept of business having a very important role in turning risks into opportunities in the whole climate space. So Ambassador, you heard Paul's very encouraging story. Lots of good things happening. 2.4 thousand companies already engaged in science-based targets, more than 350 global investors really having picked up this agenda. Hopefully we are beginning to get closer to seeing some real tipping points. But I mean, in your important role as the special envoy for the summit, what would you like to see more from business and investors?
Well, as Paul mentioned, I think what we need now is businessmen to reach to their own government and to start partnering. It's quite important. Nobody will achieve the results we need acting separately. If you take the overall level of commitments coming from Paris, we are still in a trajectory of probably above 3 degrees. So the effort that needs to be done is quite critical, and it involves the economy as a whole. It's not just an environmental issue. It is a transformation of the economy which is needed. And to do that, you need the business sector. You need the public support, the public engagement. Civil society needs to be engaged. And that's the reason why we try also to change the contribution that the United Nations can do to this process. As I mentioned before, moving from negotiations to implementation means also that the United Nations would be supporting implementation, and would be supporting implementation not only by countries, but by all stakeholders who have joined us in this effort. We will be doing the follow-up, and we are trying to promote an idea that could be I think quite important for the private sector, by which they will have their own kind of NDC, national determined contribution. We can say national business determined contribution.
Yes.
We are working with local government. We are working with society in general, organized society. And together we can achieve the goals, but the amount of effort that is needed is considerable.
That's
I'm
true.
optimistic, but we are not on track. We also need to disinvest on carbon, and we, as the Secretary-General mentioned during the trip in the Pacific, we need to find a way in which we will not tax the citizen, but we will tax the polluter. And we will discourage investment in coal plants, disinvest on those brown economy areas.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it was great to hear the very concrete request from the Secretary-General along the lines that you were mentioning. And I also know that it means a lot for you personally, that everything that will happen at the summit is multi-stakeholder. And of course it's about climate, but all the goals are connected, all the 17 goals. So it is a major systemic transformation that we are trying to address. So Jen, I want to come to you, because clearly in changing society at the magnitude that we need to do now in order to create a real transformation, I mean, that will probably require a new way of partnership and working together between government and the private sector in terms of reinforcing each other, supporting each other in a positive loop to make a 1.5 degree scenario a reality. Exactly. And I know that you and the business organizations have been working a lot with that. So could you explain a little bit about how you see that new level of cooperation between government and business?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And it's exactly right. There's a lot of action happening in the business community, and yet there's a lot more that needs to be done. And thinking about how we take the momentum that we're seeing from different companies and start to piece that together, not only to be commitments from individual companies in individual places, but how we start to piece those together and go hand in hand with the important policies needed to drive truly systemic changes. So we are seeing growing momentum in the private sector as more and more businesses recognize the cost of climate impacts here and now on their businesses, as you said, as they recognize that acting on climate is an opportunity to drive innovation, to drive competitiveness, to drive growth in new business models. And we're seeing it from across different sectors, which is extremely important, and from all over the world. And it's companies setting science-based emissions reduction targets. It's committing to powering their operations with 100% renewable energy. It's committing to electrifying their fleets, to decarbonizing their processes, and then driving change throughout their supply chains. But critically, what we need is a shift in entire systems. And so it's the power system, the transport system, heavy industry as a whole, the food and land system. And what we're seeing is signals of change from these companies around different corners of the market and how those come together. So you're seeing an increase in demand for zero carbon products and solutions. As a result, you're seeing reactions on the supply side and increases in supply. You've got power suppliers, power producers, auto manufacturers, cement manufacturers, steel manufacturers starting to commit to producing products that are net zero by 2050 to supply the demand that they're seeing in the growing market. Together, this starts to drive innovation, investment, and then you start to see the pieces of the puzzle that actually a full systems change is possible. So for one, if companies haven't set a target aligned with 1.5, if you're not thinking about aligning your strategy with a 1.5 degree future, the time is now. There's no time to wait. Businesses that are setting these targets are aligning themselves to be competitive in the future, and frankly, companies that aren't are at risk of getting left behind. And then for the other companies, the question is, what's next? How do we work together? What is this summit about? How do we work together to stitch together solutions that drive full transformational change? And that's where you get to a recognition that you can't do it without policy. And very importantly, we need leadership from the private sector and leadership and clarity from the public sector. This summit is important because it brings together heads of state at a very high level to talk about climate. to come to the stage and talk about the ways in which they are planning to increase their ambition. And it's important for companies now in the run-up to the summit, at the summit itself and beyond, to be a part of that conversation, to be coming together, to be making it clear to policymakers what policies you need to have the clarity and confidence to then go and decisively invest in these zero carbon solutions. And so that's the invitation on the table here, I think, in this summit. There's these 9 transformational areas. There's major systems that need change. There's companies out there who have solutions, who have experiences that recognize these types of policies help, these types of clear targets help inform our decision making. And that's the conversation to be had.
Yeah.
I think we're inviting people to be part of the planning now and to be ready to come and showcase that leadership on the stage at the summit itself, talking about what you're doing and why and how it's helping drive full systemic change, and then the types of policies that help that go further and faster.
So Jen, in the lead up to developing the idea of the ambition loop, we did a lot of research, I think in 20 different countries, on how the dialogue and the cooperation between the business sector and the government is actually panning out. And we learned that basically in every country, that teamwork, that partnership could be better. So could you explain our audience a little bit about the ambition loop and how they could help get that going with their governments?
Absolutely. I think the ambition loop is this concept of how leadership from the private sector helps demonstrate the solutions that are there, the economic opportunity and solutions, and demonstrate that there's real sort of political and economic support for a transition on climate. And genuine dialogues with the governments help inform exactly what those policies might look like. You need clear, bold targets that you're going to get to net zero by 2050 across the economy, that you're going to completely decarbonize the power sector, completely decarbonize the transport sector. That means clear targets around various pieces of technology and various outcomes. And then there's a lot of details to figure out how to get there. And the companies that are involved in these sectors who have the engineers and the innovators need to be a part of that dialogue. And so we've seen places where bringing those conversations together, you end up having good insights into what types of investments need to be made, where the private sector can contribute, where educational opportunities are needed, where incentives are needed, where clarity is needed from on the policy side. And that at the end of the day, it does always boil down to making sure that businesses have clarity and confidence to do more, that they know that the policy landscape is going to be stable and that it's headed in an ambitious direction, that we're moving towards limiting warming to 1.5, that we're moving towards zero emissions, a full transformation by 2050, and that then together we can all decisively work in that direction.
Sure. That's really helpful. So Paul, may I turn to you? Because, I mean, when you were the CEO for Unilever, you were actually leading an effort with the EU to install a new policy framework in the whole climate space. So what was your experience, and how can we take some of the positive learning from that to other regions in the world to create a positive policy framework for businesses?
Yeah. Well, what we found out is that when you put enough responsible businesses together and you work with politicians proactively on putting the right legislation in place, you can actually move forward. We've seen it in the European energy policies, more to be done, but at least we've moved that forward.
Sure.
We see it in the circular economy packages and many other areas. So I think we are at a period in time when politics is difficult. We've benefited in our economic growth over the last few decades from many governments putting the right policies, frameworks and things in place to make it possible. But now we are in a difficult time for global governance, a difficult time for governments to deal with these global issues. And whilst at that time we benefited from these governments to do the right thing, I think now governments could benefit from businesses helping to de-risk their processes, just like happened in Paris. So we have an obligation and a responsibility to do that. What is clear is that there are companies and countries, and focusing on the countries here, that are doing amazing things. We have 38 countries that actually have signed up on the science-based targets. Can we identify more to get to about 100 countries at the time of the climate summit? We have governors of central banks of over 30 countries that are actually increasingly getting involved, pointing out what the risk is, wanting these science-based targets. These are government people. We have 18 countries, as I said, that have put the right policies in place, that are actually seeing declines in carbon emission and an increase in overall effectiveness of their economies, just like businesses that are decarbonizing faster tend to be more profitable and more successful. And then obviously we see the cities stepping up. In the Europe now, for the in the EU alone, where I live, we have 210 mayors of cities, big cities, saying we want to get science-based targets of 1.5 degrees. Usually there are also these cities that are making commitments already for 2025 or 2030 to get rid of the combustion engine, to say it very simple. But having said that, and all that positive momentum that is there are too many that are not. And some of them actually, we sometimes have the feeling that we're slipping back. So what we need to do is we need to obviously make these governments aware of what is happening in the private sector, technology that has developed, opportunities that have come up, and why it is good. We have 60 countries now, for example, in the world where solar energy is cheaper than fossil already. But many governments aren't even aware of it. So create awareness, share success stories is absolutely important. And then actually pointing out what the opportunities and risks are. We've done that with many of the finance ministers. There are now coalitions of finance ministers actually working the climate risk, but I think we need to step that up. And this is where the voice of business is so important and obviously so crucial at this point in time. So the thing that helps us right now, which I think why it's the right time to go to politicians, is that we have a little bit more wind in the back, so to speak, than we had at the time of Paris. We really have the citizens of this world speaking up now. The youth, as we've seen with these movements, and boycotting school and all the other things with Greta Thunberg from your part of the world. But we see it with the Extinction Rebellion. We see it with the movement picking up here on the Green Deal. There are people running in these midterm elections just on climate change, trying to not politicize the issue. But there is a groundswell, I think, happening of citizens of this world that are saying, I don't want to be part of committing the biggest intergenerational crime. And I think it's also true for many business leaders that are saying we can just not afford to let it happen on our watch. So working together, reaching out to politicians, despite how difficult that is now more important than ever, with a simple objective to at least get 100 countries to up their ambitions and their 1.5 degree pass at the time that we are at the climate summit. We have an opportunity to do a little bit of a warm-up at the G7, where the President Macron in France has been very courageous to put tipping points on the agenda for oceans, for biodiversity, for climate, for financing for development. And we're getting some very encouraging traction there. Then we can do it here at the Climate Summit. And then obviously we need to give all of our support to ensure that we have a successful COP25. COP25 actually, like we saw in Lima before Paris, more important even than the COP where things get signed, because a lot of the frameworks are put in place to make that possible.
Absolutely. So Paul, thank you for giving us this good feeling that, we all want to mobilize a global movement of people, businesses, governments that can make the Paris Agreement a reality. But I think it's also an important observation that it comes down to each of us as individuals. And it's each of us in our private lives that have to get this ball rolling as well. We shouldn't forget about that. As business leaders, whatever role we have in life. So I think now we have come to the moment where we should take a few questions from our audience out there across the world. And Ambassador, one particular question that is coming up quite a few times is a question to you on what are the plans for the summit? How do you plan to use the weekend and the summit for getting together all the people that Jen and Paul were talking about and really making sure that everybody has an opportunity to address their great project and come together and show how they're creating tipping points? How's the program going to be?
Well, let me start by insisting on the importance of joining the coalitions, because the coalitions include the governments, businessmen and other members of civil society, local governments, etc. Those coalitions are now in the process of identifying actions, plans that could be presented at the summit, and they need to be very selective. We are looking for the very best. We are looking for champions. We are looking for the new innovative ideas, because we don't want a long list of initiatives. We want those that would be meaningful. Obviously, depending on the size of the country, the sense of meaningful could and the scale could be different. But those coalitions are going to present their initiatives during the weekend on the 21st and the 22nd, in the hope that most of them will make it for the Monday's session, because we will still have an opportunity to scale up and to add members, but building on the idea of partnerships. And those that are the best are going to be the ones introduced on Monday. We will not have a list of speakers. We will have a list of plans, proposals, initiatives, and whoever is behind that initiative will go to the podium and present the initiative. Wow. We will have a list of those initiatives the day after, and we will commit to do a follow-up of each of them. We will make sure that the system as a whole works in support of implementation of those actions. And by the time we meet at the COP in Santiago de Chile, the Secretary-General would be in a position not only to report on the actions that have been presented or committed, but also on the contribution that the United Nations could make for its success. We will have obviously additional events that will be of interest for the public. The youth movement is organizing a summit for their own on the Saturday. Business could organize also some parallel or complementary events on the weekend. But the most important element is to keep this idea that we are in a partnership. The invitation of the Secretary-General has been sent not only to head of state or government, but to leaders. And those that want to participate can get an invitation to be on stage if they bring substantive proposals.
Oh, that's interesting. So the ticket to get access to the summit is that you can actually present real action that will create real change.
Exactly.
I mean, we like that. So I think
action-oriented, results-based.
Yeah.
This is a new UN.
It's a new UN. And I have to say, Ambassador, I mean, I think you have been very courageous and innovative in the way that you are putting this UN conference together into a sort of very open, multi-stakeholder engagement that will happen over several days. So, I mean, may I also ask you, I think we are all very encouraged to see young people really wanting to take action and be part of the whole climate transformation. So how are you planning to involve youth in the summit?
Well, let me first tell you that the change in the approach is for the Secretary-General, because he's the one who has instructed us to be very open and to take advantage of the leadership that, as Paul was mentioning, in some cases, many cases, the business sector is taken, or local authorities, etc. So the innovation is a commitment by the Secretary-General. In terms of the participation of youth, as I mentioned before, they will have a summit, but this is not going to be only a parallel event on which they will be able to identify the main areas and proposals that they can present to the head of state or government. They will also have direct involvement through the summit itself. They could bring some of the proposals, and they can partner with other stakeholders, and they can incentivize action on each of the 9 tracks, in addition to the events that they will organize for themselves. So the presence and the influence of youth people or youngsters is going to be fundamental. The big question is not only to recognize their anger, but to allow them to be part of the decision-making process, to commit governments and to facilitate participation of young people in all sectors. And companies will be obviously very much encouraged also to take into account their own initiative, their own proposals.
Great. I think all the young people out there are really keen about your open invitation and that we will have a young voice at the summit as well. So, I mean, we are getting a lot of questions. Many of them are actually being responded to online. We can't do all of them in this short session, but there are a couple that I think are really interesting. So Jenny, if I may go back to you. I mean, this whole idea about transformation, cooperation between business and governments, creating tipping points. I mean, in all your work with businesses, can you give a couple of examples of, you know, which sectors or which initiatives where you're really seeing examples of tipping points?
Sure, thanks. We're starting to see it sort of inspirationally in a lot of places, which is important. We're starting to see it in, you know, if you take the transport sector, one of the things that we're seeing move extremely fast right now, faster every day, if you don't keep up with the statistics, you're behind on them, is the electric vehicle sector. And so you're seeing a combination of demand growing for electric vehicles from private companies. One of our initiatives is called the EV100 initiative, in which companies commit to electrifying their fleets and investing in charging infrastructure. We've got some of the biggest logistics companies who do a lot of moving of goods committed to using electric vehicles. Then that's on the demand side. On the supply side, then you see many of the vehicle manufacturers themselves actually racing to catch up with and keep up with the trends. They're making hundreds of billions of dollars of investments in electric vehicles, in part responding to what cities are doing. Cities are committing to fossil fuel-free streets. You've got cities, states, and countries putting clear end dates on when they're going to allow sales of internal combustion engines. The clarity from policymakers on that side, as soon as you know that in fact we're not going to be able to drive cars in this town anymore, internal combustion engine cars in this town anymore, we're not going to be selling those anymore, and that there's incentives on the electric vehicle side, you just start to see those really positively reinforce themselves quickly, and then exponential growth in the electric vehicle market, in battery storage market, in the infrastructure, as a good example.
Great, great. And I mean, I can already imagine how many sectors would like to be among the great examples that are being asked to present during the summit. So Paul, we also have a question regarding mitigation. And one of the many things you are investing your time in these days is also to be one of the leaders of the mitigation track of the summit. So, I mean, how do you see that moving on? What is the biggest priorities for you leading up to the summit?
Yeah, so mitigation is obviously an important part, and if you, especially in the developing markets, if you see how many people live close to the sea levels rising, natural disasters hitting the coastal lines now on a continuous basis, that's one of the areas that we need to think about, especially when it gets to infrastructure in cities. What is currently happening in the world is that every day actually we develop about an area of New York in new development, and every week a new city the size of Stockholm, going to your parts of the world, 1.2, 1.3 million people, is being created. So one of the main investments that is happening in the world beyond the Belt and Road Initiative is the investment in cities. $90 trillion over the next 15 years, $6 trillion a year. And how we design and how we invest that is going to be probably the most important decision we make for the future of mankind. I live in London. The cities are still from Roman times. Once you put a structure in, you're stuck. And the investments you can make in densification of the cities, in putting energy efficiency in their buildings, how you work your public transport, how you provide access for people to be closer to work and have more efficiency in their lifestyles, etc., is going to make a huge difference. And if we can get that into the financing plans of these major investment propositions, that's obviously enormously important. So that's an overall framework of priority. The second one is to really get the financial market involved. We have had a hard time getting money to flow especially at a national level, to many of the projects that need to happen. And we are getting the financial industry more interested now in climate mitigation and the enormous opportunities that are there. But we still need to leverage smartly the multilateral banks, the regional development banks and many of the other institutions to use their money differently and not just finance projects, but use it to take the risk portions and leverage it up and attract the private capital. If we can match the flow of financing with the plans that we're putting behind cities, then that's a big step forward. The second one is our food and land use system, I would call out. A tremendous challenge in the production of food. It's going to increase another 60-70% over the next 30 years, and the system is already broken now. So how we develop our food system is going to be absolutely crucial. We cut down 60% of the deforestation is due to the demand for food. We are still deforesting at a higher rate than we can afford. We actually should be doing reforestation. None of the countries are at the Paris commitments in this regard. So we need to think about different ways. We keep the people poor that are producing the food. We have the audacity to waste 30-40% of the food. If that would be a country, it would be the third biggest carbon emitter after China and the US. So there's some work to do on redesigning our food system. Initiatives like 12.3, goal number 12 being responsible consumption. Initiatives like 12.3, led by the World Resource Institute on cutting food waste, is starting to gain traction.
Absolutely.
So we're looking at some of these big buckets in these areas that hopefully we can feed into the summit.
Absolutely. That's a great example, Paul. And I think also underlining again the importance of personal leadership and the courage to be a change agent in no matter what role you have in society. So, I mean, we are slowly running out of time. So I want to direct the final question to you, Ambassador, because we have many companies listening in asking the question, how do they get involved? If they want to join one of the 9 coalitions in the summit, I mean, how do they do that? What will that require, and who do they call, and how to take action?
Well, I think there are many ways of doing that, and obviously, to join each of the coalitions, they need to know that we are working with 18 countries who have volunteered to lead those coalitions. All the information is available on the web page. Other countries are joining the coalitions, and business sector would be obviously welcome to join. They can also reach to us through your organizations and through my office. The question, I think, is which is fundamental, is to understand that by joining, they need to bring something. And I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about ideas, commitment. We were talking about leadership, and the leadership of the private sector is going to be recognized, but it needs to deliver, and it needs to be at the scale we need. The Secretary-General, just if I can go back a little bit with the issue of mitigation, the Secretary-General is addressing each of the major emitter countries, all the G20 members, and even some countries that may become major emitters in the near future, and he's asking specific commitments by each of them. He's taking this leadership role that it was necessary. We also need some champions within the private sector to go sector by sector and identify who are the companies that are willing to lead and to commit. We need to reduce emissions. On adaptation, I think it is also fundamental to take into account that the majority of the member states in the UN, the majority of countries in the world, are suffering a lot because of natural disasters. So we should not forget that this is a fundamental point. What we have seen in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, the Secretary-General is right now traveling to witness firsthand the problem of the rising of the sea. But the phenomena which have intensified, like the ones we witness in Africa, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, and Malawi, show us that there is also an urgency to address these questions and to not only to help rebuild the cities and the infrastructure that has been destroyed, but to do it better. So those are opportunities of leadership on which in some cases technology is already there. It just needs to be scaled up to be profitable.
Excellent.
So all these initiatives, all these champions that we can bring into our partnerships will make the difference.
Wonderful. So, I mean, the ticket to the summit is to take action. It is to bring action, not come only to talk.
Come with a plan, not with a speech. That's exactly the phrase the Secretary-General has already used.
Well, that's a perfect
and a commitment
to do something
tangible and immediately.
Ambassador, that was a perfect way to end our session today. Thank you so much also to Jen and to Paul for a great update on where we are in the summit so far. So as we have heard, we are counting on bold leadership from the private sector to help reach the necessary tipping points and to achieve a just transition to a net zero future for all. And in order to kickstart this transformation, we ask you, all the business leaders, to make climate action your priority. So set a science-based target at the 1.5 degree level of ambition. Engage with your government to create ambition loops and put a price on carbon. Private sector champions will be invited to announce concrete plans to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So in wrapping up, I would like to thank you, Ambassador, Paul, and Jen, for joining me today. And thank you, our audience, for being part of this UN Global Compact Academy session. Our teams will follow up with you very soon. We are willing and able to help you in any way. And working together, we can address this global emergency with ambition and urgency. This is a race we can and must win.